those questions in China?
Well, the best I could. I mean, we had endless discussions about all these things, but my purpose was not to go there to have an argument, but to go there and try and discover what they were doing and why, and put thoughts to them that I hoped would be helpful, and indicate that not everyone in the West was hostile to their countries.
Oliver Cam here unpacks the fundamental difference he sees between useful idiots who hold conflicting political views.
I think it comes down to the distinction between liberalism in its broadest sense, which regards human beings as perhaps more malleable than they really are, though I stand on the left myself, and conservatism, which has a more sceptical streak by nature, by philosophy. And because left-wing autocratic regimes tend to describe their operations in terms of service to humanity, the new type of human being, the new society, they tend to attract a simple-minded admiration of people on the left that those of a more conservative disposition would doubt. Useful idiots on the right tend to think rather differently. They look at brutal regimes and regard them as undiplomatic, maybe repressive, but better than the alternative.
So, to some examples. When Chile's former dictator was held under house arrest in Surrey, England, for a short spell, some people wanted to shake the hands of the London policeman who said, "General Pinochet, you're under arrest." Former government minister Norman Lamont was not one of them, campaigning instead for his quick release. As they tell the BBC World Service, Oliver Cam believes Lamont to have been Pinochet's useful idiot. Bruce Anderson emphatically does not.
People such as Lord Lamont, the former Chancellor, who regard the Pinochet regime as, again, more sinned against than sinning, and whatever the brutal measures meted out to Chilean dissidents was nonetheless a bastion of Western values in South America. That's a conceptual error and a moral one. Chile was actually one of the most appalling instances of sins of commission as well as omission by US foreign policy in that decade.
Pinochet's coup was necessary to prevent Chile from going communist. Even his critics only allege he killed, I think, under 4,000 people. If you have a big country and a threat of a communist takeover, that's quite a low casualty rate.
4,000 people, that's an acceptable price. 4,000 deaths.
Look, there will have been a lot of innocent victims, because you can't launch a coup on liberal and humane grounds. Once you decide to have a coup, first of all, you've got to win power quickly, you've got to suppress opposition quickly, you've got to deal with potential enemies quickly. It's a very unpleasant business. But if you look at the other alternatives when Pinochet took over, I think it was one of the more humane possible alternatives.
This afternoon, the first funeral in Cape Town for one of the victims of last week's confrontations with authority. Whites did not put the government in power to hand that power to the blacks. But after a year of funerals, there does appear to be a growing realization in this country that things will have to change.
In the 1980s, quite a few British Conservatives visited apartheid South Africa as a guest of the white minority regime. One was a young hopeful in the Conservative Research Department, David Cameron, now Britain's Prime Minister. Since then, Mr Cameron has publicly disavowed Mrs Thatcher's nuanced stance on apartheid and condemned it. Another guest of the apartheid state was journalist Bruce Anderson. Is he a useful idiot too?
Let's define our terms. Apartheid means apartness. Apartheid was a daft idea, and like many of the daftest ideas in the world, it was invented in a university by intellectuals. And the theory was that you would divide up South Africa, and all the races would have their portion of the country. Now that in itself is not an immoral idea. If it had been a third, it was just a crazy one, because you can't run a modern country that way. By the time I first started to go to South Africa, a lot of apartheid had been dismantled, and everyone knew that fundamental political change was on the way. So no, I don't think I was being a useful idiot.
It went deeper than people like Bruce Anderson, of course. What about the Thatcher government's fight against sanctions? Oliver Cam.
I don't believe for a moment that Mrs Thatcher had sympathy for the system of apartheid, but she gave every appearance at the time of opposing sanctions more passionately than she did the racist regime in Pretoria. Underneath that, there were members of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons who were friendly with the regime, who regarded its racial discrimination as a sort of idiosyncrasy compared with the more fundamental question that South Africa was a bastion against communism in that continent. That was a terrible judgment and an immoral one.
Now, what were Tony Benn's 5 questions for a tyrant again?
What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how could we get rid of you?
Did you ask your 5 questions to Saddam Hussein?
No, but I went particularly to ask him to release the hostages, which he did. And then I went again just before the war. Do you have weapons of mass destruction, I asked. He said no. I didn't know whether to believe him, but it was true. And then I had an open discussion.
How can you have an open discussion with a mass murderer?
Well, you talk to anybody. I mean, I think it depends on how you see the process of democracy. I think you have to talk to anybody.
When in power, Saddam had people dumped in acid baths, strangled, shot, and made their families pay for the bullets. He gassed the Kurds, killing thousands. But when George Galloway, then a prominent member of Britain's Parliament and opponent of Western sanctions against Iraq, met Saddam, there was no mention of that.
Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability, and I want you to know that we are with you, Hatal Nasser, Hatal Nasser, Hatal Quds.
He said, "Sir, I salute you for your strength, your courage, your indefatigability."
Oliver Cam.
His rationalisation afterwards was that he was addressing the Iraqi people, which, in my view, was an absurd explanation. He was directly addressing a dictator who, outside North Korea, had no peer at that time. And to imply that the Iraqi people were somehow able to organise themselves, have some sort of civic society under this regime was patently preposterous.
Would you say that George Galloway is a useful idiot of our time?
Yes, because he gave sustenance and succour to a terrible, terrible dictatorship.
He would say, I think, listen, there are voices upon voices upon voices all saying the same thing, that essentially Western capitalism, Western society is the kind of dominant voice in all the Western media. And real questions about Palestine, about the suffering of the Iraqi people under Western sanctions are never properly raised.
It's perfectly possible to identify in a disinterested, objective way, without fear or favour, suffering in Palestine or crimes of omission and commission by the Western democracies, and there have been many of those. But it's quite another to obfuscate the crimes of not just imperfect, frequently culpable governments such as our own, but utterly oppressive dictatorships.
Across the border in Iran, Shahab Mousavat worked for Press TV, Iran's state-sponsored TV channel. At first, things went well, but then came the presidential elections.
Whereas previously Press TV had been this fountain, this font of liberality, suddenly the powers that be told us that we were no longer at liberty to criticise or to put in any sort of challenging journalism so far as the presidency was concerned. We were told that we had to tone down anything that might be construed as supportive of Mr. Mousavi or any of those that were standing in opposition to Mr. Ahmadinejad. And as we went forward, it became even more apparent that really the editorial freedoms that we had enjoyed, unprecedented really in Iran, were going to be done away with.
Shortly before voting day, Shahab Mousavat resigned from Press TV. When protesters claiming that President Ahmadinejad had stolen the election filled the streets, he phoned up his old channel and asked them a question.
I asked the simple question, are you covering this? Are you covering this? This actually cost me much more than I ever imagined. This throwaway remark, a very simple question that any journalist I think should ask.
This being the demonstration by hundreds of thousands of people in Tehran saying that the election was a fraud. Did they cover the demonstrations?
They didn't cover the violence by the government authorities, but they certainly covered the protests and tried to persuade the world at large that in fact it was the demonstrators who were the orchestrators of the violence. That is entirely to turn the issues on their head.
Journalist Maziar Bahari was in Tehran covering the protest when the authorities asked him for a quiet word.
9 days after the election, on June 21st, I was arrested and I spent 118 days in Evin prison, 107 days out of those 118 days in solitary confinement.
Give me some idea of what happened to you while you were there.
Basically, there were a lot of beatings, punchings, slapping, but repeatedly. They wanted me to confess that I was a spy.
Did they break you?
They made me confess to say that the Western media was bad. I apologized to the Supreme Leader, but I never cooperated with them fully.
Are you a spy?
No, I'm not, and I was not, and I told them that.
One day, Maziar Bahari was taken from his cell into another room in the prison. Enter Press TV.
There were 3 camera crews there. But it really surprised me to see Press TV in that room, because I thought that at least they would try to pretend that they are good journalists. And I don't think any good journalist in good conscience would interview another journalist in prison, under duress, with a blindfold on his knee, in prison uniform, and cooperate with the interrogator to come up with questions.
The first thing that you actually noticed about this place was the smell, the absolute reek of feces everywhere.
Shahab Musavat.
This was hell, basically. You felt like you were going beyond the brink of anything normal. The next thing that you notice is the screams. And there's a lot of torture going on there, and you hear that. And I tell you, all this time later, it still lives with me.
Has Press TV ever covered torture in Shapur?
If you ask Press TV, I'm sure they tell you that no such thing exists. So I think the answer to that is no.
Whereas some Westerners who worked for Press TV left after its editorial line swung behind the regime, George Galloway, and the journalist famous for having been captured by the Taliban, Yvonne Ridley, did not, and both continue to work for Press TV in Britain. I asked Maziar Bahari, are they, in his book, useful idiots?
I cannot call anyone an idiot without knowing them personally, but I think they are useful for Iranian government.
How?
They are basically used by the Iranian government to send their message of hate through Press TV. And by the very fact that they are working for Press TV, they are working for the Iranian government, and they are part of this propaganda machine of the Iranian government.
George Galloway and Yvonne Ridley both declined to take part in this programme, but sent emails. On Iraq, Mr. Galloway says he was a known opponent of Saddam Hussein at a time when British and American businessmen and politicians were queuing up to do business with him. He adds that his words reported as directed at Saddam were in fact directed at the Iraqi people. On Iran, Mr. Galloway says he is responsible for his own work on Press TV and has in fact criticised the Iranian government on Press TV and elsewhere, including a denunciation of a Holocaust conference in Tehran to which Holocaust deniers were invited. Yvonne Ridley says, I am no more of a useful idiot to President Ahmadinejad than the BBC Director General Mark Thompson was a useful idiot for suppressing further criticism of the British government's dodgy dossier and the illegal invasion of Iraq, which led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. In fact, John, are you not a useful idiot yourself for the BBC? Perhaps I am a useful idiot. But as I reply to Yvonne Ridley, one difference is the BBC does report criticism of the British government, and Press TV does not report criticism of the Iranian government. Nor does the BBC interview torture victims while in prison and pretend they're at liberty. It seems as though the age of useful idiots is not quite dead yet.